German military men mocked this aircraft until it came to battle, and it became a nightmare for the Wehrmacht. When the Il-2 first appeared at the front in the summer of 1941, enormous hopes were pinned on it. But very quickly, the aircraft acquired a grim nickname, the Flying Coffin. The reason was simple. The first Il-2s were single-seaters. The pilot sat in an armored cockpit, fought the enemy and flew the machine at the same time, but he was completely unprotected from the rear. German fighters, Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs, could easily slip onto its tail and rake the attack aircraft with gunfire. The Il-2 could neither maneuver nor shake off the pursuit. It was heavy, slow, and not very maneuverable. It could not compare with the fast German fighters. For the pilots, each new mission was almost a sentence. A flight of 12 would take off, and only 2 or 3 often returned. There was a bitter joke in the ranks. Flying the Il-2 was a one-way ticket. That is how the nickname Flying Coffin arose. It reflected not only the aircraft's appearance, but the fate of its pilots. Everyone who sat in the Il-2's cockpit knew full well that the chance of returning alive shrank with every new combat. And yet, pilots kept going out again and again because they knew their strikes on columns, tanks, and enemy positions could decide the outcome of battles. Only later, when the designers made changes and added a rear gunner, did the situation begin to change. German fighters could no longer gun down the attack aircraft with impunity from behind. But the nickname stuck. Flying Coffin remained a reminder of the terrible years of 1941 to 1942, when losses were monstrous, and every flight felt like the last. The Il-2 became a symbol of two things at once. For Soviet pilots, it was the machine in which they had to look death in the face every day. For the Germans, it was a dreadful enemy whose appearance on the horizon promised fire and destruction. At the end of the 1930s, the Soviet leadership understood well. A new major war was inevitable. The experience of the First World War, the Spanish Civil War, and conflicts in the Far East clearly showed that a classic army could no longer rely only on artillery and infantry. Aviation was beginning to play an ever greater role on the battlefield. But there was one serious but. Existing aircraft could bomb cities and fight in the air, yet they could not effectively support infantry and tanks directly on the front line. Soviet military doctrine required a machine that could become a true artilleryman in the sky. An aircraft capable of accompanying advancing units, destroying tanks, suppressing machine gun nests, scattering enemy columns, and literally burning a path for the Red Army. In other words, a ground attack aircraft was needed. At that time, there were almost no such machines in the world. The Germans were experimenting with their Ju-87 Stuka dive bomber, but it was more a bomber than an armored attacker. The Soviet Union had a chance to create a unique weapon, an aircraft designed specifically for fighting at treetop height. It was then that chief designer Sergei Ilyushin proposed an idea that seemed almost fantastic at the time: a fully armored aircraft. Its engine, cockpit, and vital components were to be enclosed in an armored capsule capable of withstanding bullets and shrapnel. Such an aircraft could approach enemy positions at minimal altitude without fearing rifle and machine gun fire and deliver aimed strikes against tanks and fortifications. For the country, this was not just a technical task, but a matter of survival. The Soviet Union was preparing for war and needed a machine that could shield infantry and tanks and break the enemy's defenses on the battlefield. Thus was born the idea of the Il-2, the attack aircraft destined to become the most mass-produced combat airplane in history, and a symbol of Soviet aviation. The first Il-2s entered service literally weeks before the war began. On June 22, 1941, there were only a few hundred in operational units, pitifully few for such a vast front. But in the very first days, Soviet command was forced to throw the new machines into battle. One of the earliest combat episodes occurred on July 1st, 1941, near Orsha. A group of Il-2s attacked German tank columns racing east. For Wehrmacht soldiers, it was a surprise. Heavy, low-flying aircraft literally dropped out of the clouds and struck the column. Shells and bombs pierced the armor of light tanks. Trucks laden with ammunition burst into flames one after another. Witnesses recalled such panic among German units that vehicles swerved off the road into fields just to escape the fire. However, the joy of early successes proved short-lived. The Il-2 was heavy and slow. It flew low and right over enemy positions. The Germans quickly understood its vulnerability. It was enough to call in fighter cover, and the new Soviet attackers became easy prey. They simply had no rear defense. Pilots complained, "A Messerschmitt gets on your tail and it's over. We can't even turn away." Losses were catastrophic. Often, a flight of 10 or 12 Il-2s went into action, and only 2 or 3 returned to base. Too often, the new machines burned over the battlefield before proving their value. It was then that the grim nickname "Flying Coffin" became fixed in the forces. Pilots bitterly joked that an Il-2 sortie was a ticket one way. And yet, despite the huge losses, the Red Army Command saw the new aircraft's potential. When the Il-2 was used skillfully with fighter escort, the effect was impressive. German columns scattered, fortifications turned into smoking ruins, and infantry abandoned positions under the fire of cannons and rockets. Even in 1941, when the USSR suffered defeat after defeat, the Il-2 showed this was a weapon of the future that, if applied properly, could turn the tide of battles. For the Germans it remained a two-faced symbol. On the one hand, slow and vulnerable, easy prey for their aces. On the other, a terrible threat to anyone on the ground. German memoirs preserved the words of tankers. "When that armored beast appeared in the sky, your heart clenched. We knew hell was about to begin." Such was the Il-2's first combat experience in 1941, a blend of horrific losses and first victories. Its future was still in doubt, but the very idea of an armored attacker proved its worth. And Soviet leadership decided not to remove the Il-2 from production, but instead to build it in even greater numbers and improve the design. It was then that the story began of the aircraft that gradually turned from a flying coffin into the enemy's Black Death. By 1942, the Il-2's fate hung by a hair. Losses remained huge, and soldiers continued to joke bitterly that Il stood for "I'm leaving and not coming back." Command knew the problems. The aircraft was protected in front, but completely vulnerable from behind. German fighters slipped onto its tail and destroyed attackers one after another. Even designer Sergei Ilyushin received letters from frontline pilots with desperate pleas, "Give us at least a gunner." One pilot cannot fly, attack, and defend all at once. In the end, a decision was made. The design was changed. Behind the pilot's cockpit, a position was installed for a second crewman, a rear gunner. He was armed with a UBT machine gun capable of beating off tail attacks. The machine became a two-seater, From that moment, the Il-2 turned into a true flying tank, able not only to strike but to defend itself in the air. Results appeared immediately. German fighters, used to gunning down Il-2s with impunity, suddenly began taking losses. Now, a tail attack could be answered with a burst of machine gun fire, and many Luftwaffe aces became more cautious. This changed the psychology of combat. The Il-2 no longer seemed doomed. It became a formidable, survivable machine that could make it home even after heavy fighting. Along with this, tactics changed. The Il-2 stopped flying alone or in tiny groups. Now it went out in orderly flights and squadrons. Dozens of flying tanks descended on German columns, and their salvos turned roads into blazing graveyards of equipment. Under the gunners' protection, and with Soviet fighters escorting, the Il-2 became virtually invulnerable to light weapons. It was in this period that it received a new nickname from the Germans, Schwarzer Tod, the Black Death. Wehrmacht tankers admitted, "When those armored monsters appeared in the sky, we felt helpless." From an object of mockery and a symbol of losses, the Il-2 became an instrument of mass destruction, a weapon that truly could change the course of battles. The turning point came precisely when the aircraft ceased to be a flying coffin for its own crews and became a nightmare for the enemy. Its greatest victories still lay ahead. The Il-2 was not just a strike aircraft, it was a machine for which a special set of tactics was developed, a combination of methods and cooperation that let the armored attacker reach maximum effectiveness and survive in the harshest conditions. Understanding this means understanding how assault aviation influenced the outcome of ground operations. An Il-2 attack was built around the idea low, fast, accurate. Unlike bombers that worked from high altitude, attackers approached targets at minimal height, literally over bushes and rooftops. This reduced early detection and cut the time the enemy had to deliver aimed fire. Low flight allowed precise hits on moving targets, tanks, truck columns, artillery positions. For this, the Il-2 used a mix of cannons and machine guns, small bombs, and rockets, everything needed to destroy both a single tank and a long line of vehicles. The key element was maneuvering in flights. Attackers flew in organized groups, wedge or finger four formations, where each machine had a role. A leader aimed at armor. Wingmen covered the flanks and watched for flak, and others held suppressive fire to break up any countermeasures. Thanks to tight formations, the Il-2 created overwhelming mass firepower, cascades of machine gun and cannon bursts raining down at once, depriving the enemy of any chance to react quickly. Sequencing of runs mattered. Typically, the firing pass came first. The plane lined up on target, opened up with guns, dropped bombs, or fired rockets, then immediately broke away to make room for the next element. Ideally, the assault wave struck the column not once but in several successive runs, so that destruction was systemic, not incidental. First, suppressing gun positions, then hitting armor and fuel trucks, and finally, finishing off and isolating surviving equipment. Coordination with ground forces was inseparable from success. Command pre-agreed target lists. Artillery and aviation worked within one plan. The Il-2 hit sectors where infantry was preparing to advance or cut enemy supply corridors ahead of tank attacks. The synergy multiplied the effect. After the assault sweep, infantry entered an area where the enemy had lost mobility and morale. Artillery finished the rest. Sometimes, attackers performed tactical reconnaissance by fire, provoking hidden gun positions to reveal themselves so they could be destroyed by fighters or artillery. Defending against flak and fighters demanded strict discipline because the Il-2 worked low. It was constantly in range of light anti-aircraft guns and heavy machine guns. So, against fortified positions, corridors of fire were built. Flights went in series, with pauses between runs to hinder AIA correction. Ambush and surprise were used widely. Planes hid in clouds appeared at dawn or approached from sectors expected to have weak AIA. After two-seat variants appeared with a rear gunner, Il-2 crews could even drive off pairs of interceptors, which significantly reduced vulnerability and increased crew survival. Psychology was part of the tactic. The Il-2's appearance over a road often triggered immediate disintegration of a column. Tankers and drivers, seeing the armored silhouette and hearing the whine of rockets or the roar of cannon fire, abandoned vehicles and scattered. Panic multiplied their vulnerability. Sometimes the effect of one or two passes was more valuable than days of artillery preparation. The attackers induced instant demoralization and paralyzed enemy logistics. By early 1942 to 1943, the Il-2 was no longer a one-off experimental machine, but a nationwide project. This was not merely a factory order, it became a national program in which every element served the front. Production of the attacker expanded with unprecedented speed and organization. Factories that had built civilian aircraft or entirely different products were repurposed. Technologies were standardized, and the design simplified to accelerate assembly and reduce the need for scarce materials. The Il-2 embodied a simple yet brilliant idea, a design that could be mass-produced. Engineers accepted compromises, cutting labor-intensive operations and unifying components. The armored bathtub, the engine, and major assemblies became modular elements that could be built in parallel on separate lines and quickly mated into a complete airframe. This allowed large output with relatively modest resources. Industrial capacity in the east of the country was crucial. Plants were evacuated to the Urals and Siberia. New enterprises joined production, shops were built, and transport routes deployed. Entire shifts labored on the lines. Men at the front were replaced by women, teenagers, and older workers. And sometimes specialists from the rear were mobilized for one goal: to release one more Il-2 that would take to the sky over the front tomorrow. This collective work gave the aircraft another status: the people's plane. The Il-2 ceased to be merely military hardware. It became a symbol of the entire nation's contribution to victory. Mass production was accompanied by technological simplifications, favoring speed of assembly and repair. Some parts were made of wood or less scarce alloys where feasible. Other elements were standardized so that damaged units could be swapped quickly right in field workshops. Logistics were refined in parallel. Spares, munitions, and repair teams moved in step with the series, enabling a high tempo of Il-2 operations at the front. The numbers speak for themselves. The aircraft was produced in such quantities that it quickly ceased to be a rarity in the troops. The Il-2 became the most mass-produced combat aircraft of its time. Tens of thousands reached the front, allowing full squadrons to be equipped on all key directions. Mass meant not only numerical advantage, but qualitative effect. Anywhere on the front, groups of attackers could appear and deliver crushing blows to enemy communications and columns. The social image of a people's plane was reinforced by propaganda and daily practice. Newspapers ran reports from factory floors, told of shifts that produced a single machine in record time, of shock brigades that met special targets. Letters and parcels from those who assembled the aircraft accompanied it to the front. The feeling that the plane was made with our own hands boosted morale and the bond between rear and front. The military effect of mass production was clear, too. If in 1941 the IL-2 appeared sporadically and could not fundamentally change the situation, the mass series enabled systematic application. Entire regiments and divisions received regular air support. Enemy supply was under the switch of constant strikes. Offensives were provided with artillery from the sky. The IL-2 could operate in a mode of continuous pressure. Daily sorties, one after another, exhausted the enemy and ruined his capacity to maneuver. One cannot fail to note the human factor. Factories were staffed not only by professional aircraft builders, but by thousands taking on a complex machine for the first time. Their selfless labor, often under bombing and in the harsh conditions of evacuation, made possible the production surge that elevated the IL-2 to the rank of a mass combat aircraft. In this sense, People's Plane is not a metaphor, but an objective description of society's participation in creating a weapon. Thus, mass production turned the IL-2 from a rare and vulnerable machine into a backbone element of Soviet aviation. It is a story not only of technology, but of the country, a story of mobilization, standardization, technological adaptation, and collective labor that together made the IL-2 one of the key factors in the struggle for victory. The IL-2 was often called a flying tank, but a tank does not fight by itself. Human will and courage are required. IL-2 pilots were a special caste. They knew their job meant constant risk. Every mission demanded flying low, under heavy machine gun and flak fire, right into the hottest part of the battle. The chances of returning intact were vanishingly small, and yet hundreds of crews completed missions to the end, turning their aircraft into an instrument of retribution. Among the IL-2's heroes are names that entered history. One of the most famous is Alexander Yefimov, twice hero of the Soviet Union. Flying the IL-2, he made hundreds of combat sorties, destroying columns of equipment, tanks, and artillery positions. In one battle, his squadron smashed a German train. Witnesses recalled that only a smoking pile of scrap remained. After the war, Yefimov became Commander-in-Chief of the USSR Air Force, a living symbol of the attack pilot generation. Another legend was Alexander Mazurenko, also twice hero. He was considered one of the most effective attacker pilots, with dozens of destroyed tanks, armored vehicles, and munitions depots to his credit. He could handle the machine so that even under heavy enemy fire, he avoided direct hits and led his flight to the target. For subordinates, he was an example, calm, confident, always first into the attack. A special place belongs to the feat of Alexei Isayev. His Il-2 was hit during an attack, and the engine died right over the battlefield. Instead of bailing out, he aimed the burning aircraft at a cluster of enemy tanks and rammed them. This self-sacrificing act cost him his life, but halted the German advance and gave Soviet troops time to regroup. Rear gunners showed tremendous heroism as well, the very second crewmen who covered the Il-2's tail. Their job was among the most deadly. In an open position almost unprotected, the gunner held off attacks to the last. There is a known case of gunner Ivan Kloshkov, who, mortally wounded, continued firing at approaching Messerschmitts and only after beating off the attack, lost consciousness. The crew returned to base. Only then did they notice the gunner had died at his post, clutching the grip of his machine gun. In German tankers' memoirs, one often finds the words Black Death, and this nickname referred not only to the machine, but also to its pilots. They appeared suddenly as if from nowhere, unleashed fire and bombs, and then vanished over the horizon, leaving behind only the burning hulks of equipment. The heroes of the Il-2 are not only individual names, but an entire generation who learned to fight in a machine considered a flying coffin at the start of the war and turned it into one of the Red Army's most fearsome weapons. Their courage and skill made the Il a true symbol of war, and their deeds still remind us that behind every triumph of technology stands a human being. At the start of the war, the Germans indeed looked on the Il-2 with contempt. Early battles exposed its weaknesses: heavy, slow, defenseless from the rear. Luftwaffe pilots called it easy prey and hunted it eagerly. German aces wrote, "We shot these machines down by the dozen." To them, the Ils initially symbolized Soviet helplessness in the air, but the longer the war went on, the more perceptions changed. By 1942 to 1943, the Il-2 was being produced en masse, a gunner's position was added, and tactics were refined. Then the German forces first met the new face of this machine. For tankers and infantrymen, the Il-2 became a nightmare. They no longer laughed. On the contrary, they panicked at its appearance. German memoirs preserve vivid descriptions. One tanker wrote, "When that low-flying monster appeared in the sky, your heart dropped. Its guns pierced armor, and its rockets turned a column into a blazing hell. We hid under vehicles, in ditches, in craters, anywhere but the road." Another officer recalled that at the sight of attackers, infantry scattered, dropping their weapons, because they knew it was almost impossible to stop the attack. Even the Luftwaffe had to admit the change. With the gunner installed, the Il-2 was no longer defenseless. German fighters suffered losses, and attacking the attackers required group tactics and distractions. Documents noted, "With each year fighting, the Il-2 becomes harder. There are many of them. They act boldly, and our troops on the ground fear them." Mass attacks made a particularly strong impression. When dozens of Il-2s rose over the horizon, German troops experienced real shock. Soldiers said, "It's like an artillery barrage from above, and there is no hiding from it." It was then that the Il-2 earned from the enemy the nickname Schwarzer Tod, Black Death. Thus, the mockery of the first years turned into recognition. From a flying coffin for its own crews, the Il-2 became a symbol of terror for the enemy. The Germans no longer laughed. For them, the appearance of these aircraft in the sky meant the battle was lost before it even began. By the war's end, the Il-2 was not just a combat airplane, but a true symbol of the Red Army. Its ubiquity, toughness, and battlefield role made it the embodiment of Soviet aviation. Wherever the Red Army advanced, attackers led the way, and their appearance over the battlefield became a sign to soldiers that victory was approaching. Troops called the Il-2 a flying tank. For infantry, it was a reliable friend and protector, arriving in the harshest moments. For tank crews, it was an ally from the sky, able to stop German counterattacks and destroy enemy armor. For commanders, the Il-2 was an instrument without which no major offensive could be planned. It provided fire pressure, broke supply lines, and paralyzed the enemy's defenses. Mass production made the Il-2 the people's plane. Women and teenagers in the rear built it and sent it to the front with letters and parcels. Soldiers knew that behind each aircraft stood the hands of hundreds of ordinary people working day and night for one goal: to bring victory closer. To frontline troops, the eels symbolized not only the Army's strength, but the entire rear, the entire nation risen to fight. After the war, the eel, too, remained in memory as the symbol of victory in the air. It appeared in films and newsreels. Newspapers wrote about it. It became the hero of children's books and veterans' memoirs. Even decades later, when jet aircraft were in service, the Il-2 lived on in memory as the legend that helped turn the war's tide. The Il-2 was not perfect. It was born in torment and cost thousands of lives. But it was the machine that embodied the war's burden and resolve. For enemies, it was the Black Death. For Soviet soldiers, it was a symbol of salvation and retribution. And so today, when we speak of the victory of 1945, among the first images is the silhouette of an Il-2 skimming low over the battlefield, carrying on its wings the memory of the heroism and sacrifices without which there would have been no victory. The story of the Il-2 is not merely the story of a single combat machine. It is the story of a nation, a people, and a time when the very existence of the Soviet Union hung by a thread. When the enemy believed in his invincibility and one's own forces seemed weak and doomed. The Il-2 appeared in those harshest days, and its fate eerily mirrored the country's own. From initial defeats, mockery, and humiliation, to persistence, growth, and, in the end, to victory. In 1941 it was called the Flying Coffin. The Germans laughed, slow, clumsy, easy prey for fighters. Even Soviet pilots said that taking the Il-2's controls was signing your own death warrant. Losses were such that sometimes only 2 or 3 planes returned from an entire flight. Yet despite this, command did not abandon the idea. Designers sought solutions, engineers reworked the machine, and pilots raced it into battle again and again. The Il-2's turning point came when a second man, a gunner, was added. That changed everything. The Germans could no longer attack with impunity from the rear, and losses fell. Mass production turned the Il-2 into a people's plane. Thousands were built. Entire factories worked solely on it. On the lines stood women and teenagers. For Soviet soldiers, the Il-2 became a symbol that the country would not give up, that behind them stood a home front, ready to labor day and night for the front. On the battlefield, the Il-2 became a fearsome predator. It swept low over enemy columns, fired rockets, dropped bombs, and shredded tanks and armored cars with cannon fire. Wehrmacht tankers recalled that at its appearance columns panicked and dove off roads into fields, while infantry tried to hide in ditches and craters. For the Germans, the Il-2 became the Black Death. Their mockery turned to fear, and the word ill entered German memoirs as a symbol of defeat on the Eastern Front. But behind every Il-2 attack stood people. Pilots and gunners went on sorties knowing perfectly well they might not return. They watched comrades burn in the sky, saw entire flights vanish in flames, and still took off again. These were not simply operators of a machine. They turned it into an instrument of retribution. Their feats entered history. Pilots who rammed, gunners who died at their posts, commanders who led flights through dense fire to complete the mission at any cost. The Il-2 became the most mass-produced combat aircraft in history, more than 36,000 machines. More importantly, it became a symbol of resistance. Wherever dozens of IL-2s appeared on the front, Red Army soldiers knew it was a sign the attack would succeed and the enemy would be stopped. For them, the drone of its engines meant support and hope. For the enemy, the same sound meant terror and destruction. After the war, the IL-2 remained in memory not only as a weapon, but as the image of victory. It featured in newsreels and films. Books were written about it. It was called the flying tank and the winged weapon of the people. And today, when we recall the great patriotic war alongside the T-34 and the Katyusha, there is always the silhouette of the Il-2, the machine that became a symbol of courage and sacrifice. This story teaches a simple but important lesson. Never underestimate the enemy. What seems weak and useless may turn into a terrible weapon. The Il-2 began as a flying coffin that drew laughter and became the Wehrmacht's Black Death. It became a legend, proving that even in the darkest times, willpower, persistence, and mass effort can turn mockery into a weapon and weakness into a symbol of victory. And today, when we hear in old footage the low rumble of Il-2 engines, we understand this is not just the sound of an old machine. It is the voice of that war, the voice of millions who fought and labored for victory. It is a reminder that heroism is measured not only by technology, but by a person's readiness to see the task through at any cost.